Stigmatization around mental health still exists. In the last several years, there's been an uptick in shared treatment experiences, specifically for those who were in treatment as an adolescent over the last 30 years. As a consultant working with young adults only, it's been unsettling to hear about the horrific experiences that some folks have described. As someone trained as a counselor, we were taught to do no harm. I lead with this for each client I work with. While recording this special parent series, over the last year, several parents have suggested I interview their young adults. The special parent series is noted as being just that. It's about the parent perspective only. I'm now branching out to launch the former participant series, extending the opportunity for former participants who feel comfortable talking about their journey, doing so on this podcast. No topic is off limits, and not all stories are positive. This series is meant to be honest, transparent, and real for each individual's experience through the treatment continuum. Please note that this special former participant series is the adult's perspective of their treatment experience during adolescence or as a young adult. This is merely one perspective of a single story, and it's important to know that names have been changed for the protection of the interviewee unless they have requested not to do so. These episodes may include details surrounding suicide, self-harm, substance abuse, including overdose, hospitalizations, psychotic episodes, and other traumatic experiences which include parts of the treatment journey. That includes working with consultants, being escorted by a transport company, wilderness therapy, and a residential treatment program. All that is to say, listener discretion is advised. Welcome to an episode with a former participant in treatment.
It's time now for the Success is Subjective podcast. Here is your host and therapeutic consultant for young adults only, Joanna Lilly.
Hi, and welcome to the show. Today, my guest, who is a former program participant, is Christopher Bennett. Chris is a 15-year behavioral health entrepreneur and investor. He has worked in and co-developed healing milieus from private pay, high-end programs serving severe and persistent mental illness in a therapeutic community setting, to a holistically integrated Medicaid program for indigent women challenged with substance use disorder. However, Christopher's story begins and is defined much by the pain and suffering he experienced as a child and young person, leading to a dark and tumultuous adolescent period of his life. And it wasn't until literally the moment that we ended the interview that we made the connection that we grew up extremely close by and might have even crossed paths in our earlier lives. But regardless, hope and inspiration are the hallmarks of Christopher's journey from troubled teen to loving father, brother, son, partner, and friend. Let's get to the interview now with Christopher on today's edition of Success is Subjective. Well, Christopher, thank you for being a guest on today's episode of Success is Subjective. We're specifically kicking off kind of a more targeted former participant series, which honestly, for the first 200 episodes of this podcast, a lot of former participants were guests, but I just wasn't asking questions. So I'm excited for you to show up and you kind of, where I'm going to jump ahead, you have personal experience and professional experience. So we want to get to both of those. Let's start right from the beginning, because offline you just said this started a really long time ago. So where did you actually grow up and how old were you when you went to treatment for the first time? But then give us even the backstory, like what was even going on in your world prior to that transition? So that's a lot all at once.
Absolutely. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Joanna. And thank you for the work that you do with families and helping people to address some of these things that are going on, especially with our youth and adolescent and young adult population. So it's an honor to be here. I'm 39 years old, but this journey began, really early on in life. I remember as early back as really kindergarten and first grade, not feeling comfortable, not feeling like I fit, not feeling a part of, feeling like something was a bit wrong, a bit off. I remember telling my family in first grade that I knew school wasn't for me. So like things really at these, when I look back and think about these intuitions and these experiences, that something really was not right and something was off at a really young age. I was a talented athlete. I was a great student. And so athletics and academics kept me going and to a certain point. But really in that kind of summer between 7th and 8th grade is when things really started to fall off the rails. And there were signs before this, folks would diagnose, right? They loved to diagnose back in the 90s in particular and say, your son has ADHD and ADD and, take this medication. And, I don't think I was the right candidate for stimulant medications as an adolescent. And yet I was introduced to that stuff again. Like my parents, I think, were trying to do the best that they could at the time with the information that was available. And when I was introduced to drugs and alcohol at 13 years old, again, whether that's eighth grade, right around seventh, eighth grade, it was completely life altering for me. And so it was, again, I think a lot of the stories we hear, just this general sense of calm and peace and serenity that I think I'd been seeking for so long. And so at that point, like I really became kind of hooked, right? Oh, this thing works. This is how I can change the way that I feel, and that really began the journey from about 13 on. So I'll pause there and see if there's anything you want me to dive into a little bit more on kind of that prequel journey.
Yeah, I think, well, the only thing that I want to just kind of acknowledge is you said your parents did the best that they could with the information that was out there. And I mean, I think if we look back on treatment in general, you see trends in here's a 10-year span. In the 90s, it was ADHD, right? Like in the early 2000s, it was something else. And so unfortunately, we're learning from these, in hindsight, we did the best we could, but we wish we knew differently, or we wish there was more information. And maybe we would have, in your case, right? Like maybe your parents would have said, maybe a stimulant's not a good idea.
Right.
But it is what it is. So let's segue right into, so then 13 on, what happened?
And I'll pause for 1 second before getting there, Joanna, because I think all the families I've ever worked with, there's a lot of these terms, right? In terms of what you've talked about, in terms of how things have evolved from the 90s, 2000s to where we are now in 2024, and thinking, how long parents were called enablers and called codependent and all of this. And, I still think that the industry struggles with telling parents this and labeling them something instead of saying, I'm pretty sure what you were doing was everything you could to save your kid's life. And you actually were showing up in many ways like a warrior, right? Mm-hmm. With not a lot of information, with a lot of misinformation and not a lot of really true guidance on what to do and how to help. And so, to the parents out there, I think, helping to shift that mentality, or at least that language, to suggest that you really were, my parents were doing everything that they could with everything that they had and the best capabilities they had to help somebody that was really struggling. And so, the next 10 years were really like a train going off the tracks as best it could. So again, athletics kept me, somewhat engaged in school, but really I joke with people now and say I have an 8th grade education. So, academics went out the window. I did everything I could to not be at school and to doing really anything I could to cope with the way that I felt at the time. And so that feeling of emptiness, that feeling of loneliness, that feeling of anxiety, which again, obviously hindsight's 2020, being almost 40 years old now and having worked in the space for going on 20 years, I was struggling with, really underlying trauma, attachment, right? Some of these things where I just, I was looking for love in ways. And so, I began using substances that mirrored that experience of being okay. And so I was looking for attention. I continually think about that. I was screaming, someone, please, look, see how much pain that I'm in. And at the time, I think really what we were talking about was this is a troubled teen, right? I think that was a lot of the language back then, is this is really kind of this troubled teen. And so I went from, I grew up in really I was institutionalized. So I grew up between going to military schools. I was at 2 different military schools. I went to wilderness therapy. I went to outpatient treatment. I went to inpatient treatment. I went to religious high school. I went to public high school. My family continued to say, well, this didn't work, so let's try this and let's try this now. And so that was really a lot of what and throw in there, incarceration and legal troubles and things like that. And so you know, in a lot of ways, I feel like I didn't have an adolescence because I spent kind of going from one place to the next, to the next, to the next. And it wasn't until really getting to a place of such kind of, deep pain and suffering really within myself that there was really kind of an intrinsic motivation to try and change when I was 23.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to ask, like, did that intrinsic change happen at the end of that 10-year mark? And then I also think about too, as you're talking, like really at the core of all of this was the attachment piece or kind of that trauma. And here you are talking about like constantly being in transition, which makes it impossible for you to have and establish healthy attachments.
Right. Yeah. So my partner now said something within the last couple of years. She said, you're one of the most independent people I've ever met. And she said, I don't think that's a good thing. Right. And so to reflect on that is exactly what you just described was I basically began to learn that I was able to trust myself in some way, but really I wasn't able to trust anybody around me. And so even when I was coming in contact with probably incredible human beings that were really trying to help, there was just this part of me that continued to look and say, like, I can't trust what this person's saying. I can't trust what this person's doing. I really can rely on myself. And really that's it. And to watch how that's manifested right over the past, call it 20 years has been really fascinating. And a topic that feels like really important to me today in 2024 is conversations with families really around the greatest asset that a family has is the intergenerational health. And so, many families, of course, you work with families as well, is talking about, intergenerational wealth. So we financial plan and how do we pass on what we've accumulated to our children and all of these things. And yet the conversation really around intergenerational health and like, what's our living legacy that we're passing on to our children and our children's children goes far beyond, what we do from a financial perspective. And, and hopefully what we try to do is obviously strive to be a little bit more effective, a little bit more supportive, loving, compassionate than our parents were so that we can stop these patterns from kind of going from one generation to the next.
I love that. I don't think I've actually ever heard that intergenerational health. That is quite the legacy because as you were talking to, I was just thinking about how, grandparents thinking about their grandkids, like, well, I'm going to start some bond or something like that. And by the time they turn 18, it will accrue to X amount of money. And now we're building these trusts and like, you're going to be financially well off for the rest of your life. But money doesn't buy happiness. It doesn't buy health. And so I think that's where my head was going as you were talking about that. Like, wow, that is quite the legacy to leave.
And my story, how I look and say, there was intrinsic motivation that prompted change. And yet there was a lot of external motivation as well at that point, right? So again, there were legal things that had come up. My family, again, had reached a point where they had done really everything that they thought they could do. They had really kind of disconnected from me, right? Friendships, a lot of these things, like the world in a sense was collapsing around me, which I think helped prompt some of this. And what I'm really careful with families is that although that is the story of some, that does not need to be the story, especially today when we think about everything going on with, fentanyl and a lot of these things that, hoping that at some point some kid hits rock bottom, right, is really dangerous mentality. Right. So it's like, oh, and we might go to an Al-Anon meeting or something where someone says, look, we're really powerless to help and all of this. And I would say it's absolutely not true. And this is, again, somebody who is deeply entrenched in the recovery community. I just celebrated 16 years sober. Like, it gave me a life. It is something I believe deeply in. And I think that, recovery communities, really originated in the 1930s. And it's 2024. So although there's a lot of benefit to community, to engagement, to attachment, to healthy attachment in those communities, there's a lot of evidence and there's a lot of other ways to help today than I think we had 10 years ago, 15, 20, 50 years ago. And so some of the old ideology around, this kid just needs to hit bottom, although that is an experience of a lot of kids, adolescents, youths, young adults, it by no means is the rule. To me, we would hope to transition really that to being the anomaly where we can see, hey, like this kid's really struggling, right? Like, I think looking back, and I have a lot of disdain for the treatment industry. I think a lot of the reason I got into the space was because I feel like my family was betrayed in a lot of ways. I see families right now really struggling with this. And I think families experiencing betrayal as a result of the behavioral health industry and feeling like they were duped, they were sold, they were, everyone's kind of, there's a lot of overpromising, under delivering. And so that ability to help kind of unwind some of that and to realize that oftentimes like kids just need to be loved. And that's a really hard thing because kids that are struggling, whether it's with substance use, mental health, they can be really tough. It can be really tough to love somebody that's addicted. Like it's really hard. And yet at the core, so often that is like, we need to be seen and heard. And a lot of times it's that like families are terrified, right? They're terrified. And so it's like, gosh, this idea of how do we love and see and care and do all that? How do we do that while trying to help a kid? It's really challenging. So again, this multifactorial and very complex of how do we help kids today? And yet I think at the core, so often it's like kindness and love are so often what, and me, like I was a fighter. I was bigger. I have a deep voice, right? Like I can present in a certain way. And yet really what I needed is like, I needed a hug. I needed people to say like, I love you and you're seen. And like, we see your pain and all of this. And like, I really, like that was something that I didn't experience as an adolescent.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously we're hearing you talk about the experiences that you had over that 10-year period, then translating to what you've been doing for the last almost 20 years, like professionally. So take me back to kind of, as you said, that intrinsic motivation at 23. Talk us through how you got to where you are now and tell us what is it specifically that you're doing? Because you're talking about a lot of like what families need and how you're working in this space, but give us the like nitty gritty details. What are you doing? How can people connect with you?
Sure. I've had an interesting career because again, I wanted nothing to do with this industry. And so, I got sober and so much of what changed for me was I truly believe like another man saw me. And it was the first time that an adult man saw me as a 23-year-old kid and showed me love, like unconditionally. And I think that like something inside of me went like, wow, like this is what I've needed my whole life. Now, there was a lot of work, of course, that's happened and continues to happen over the last 16 years as a result of that. But I took a job in treatment. I started working directly with clients, in long-term residential mental health care. I transitioned and started working for a veteran-specific 185-bed treatment center for homeless veterans, became really kind of indoctrinated into trauma and attachment wounding. And I was young at the time. I was 25, so I was working with a lot of young combat veterans from the OEF and OIF stuff over in the Middle East. And that then transitioned really into, personality wise, I was never going to be a great employee. I was always a terrible employee and questioned everything and thought we could do it differently and better. And so then kind of began my entrepreneurial journey. And that's when I began working with families really intensively. It was in 2012 and started a consulting company that was really focused. Because again, I've always looked at it like there's kind of an educational consultant side of things. And then we really were focused specifically kind of on mental health consulting and very similar in a lot of ways, but our expertise was not in therapeutic placements, boarding schools, things like that. It was more like, how do we get people into treatment and work with families? And I had built that company and worked with, hundreds of families, and I really burnt out. It's very difficult work, as you well know. And because it was mental health specific, we were working all around the US and I was living in hotels and left that. I started a treatment center because I looked after working with all these families and thought we were really missing this trauma and attachment piece, as well as working with families directly in treatment. And so we had started a treatment center in Northern Virginia for young adults, really focused on this kind of systemic family health. And, we were working with families about a third as much as we were working with patients. And so it was this really beautiful thing. And then realized that wasn't it for me, and we sold that program. And I began consulting really on the business side of helping companies in the space. So helping companies to execute vision and how do we take these things at a broader kind of macro level as well, which again, it's different to impact the world in that way, because when it's your thing, you can impact a certain amount of families and you can hire people and all that. But when you're working with organizations, you can start impacting, hundreds and thousands of people. by helping organizations to address things like trauma-informed care and what does that look like and what does it mean to meet people where they are. And within that process, I've done a variety of things, including investing in companies. And a lot of what I've really become really passionate about is creating opportunities to increase access to care and affordability to care, because with families, right, like really kind of 1% of the families in the US can afford, these private pay experiences that we have. And so how can we take some of our knowledge that we have and can we translate that into opportunities to increase accessible and affordable care? And so I became involved with a couple friends really just out of conversations and started a company called Aligned Living Collective, which was really an opportunity to kind of meet people where they are and to provide care, in the home, in the community, anywhere in the US or the world at a really affordable price point with a really high value proposition using outcomes and measurement-based care. And again, really transitioning philosophically in many ways to this idea that the people we work with, they have the answers. It really becomes our responsibility to help bring the answers out of them. It takes a lot of pressure off of the professional as well, because when I have to have the answer for you as a professional, that's a lot of weight to carry. And so when you've worked in the space long enough, and I think this is, again, what led to a lot of burnout on my end over the years, especially the first 10 years of my career, was thinking I had to have the answer for a family. I had to have the answer for someone, instead of realizing that the answer already exists within this family. It already exists within this person I'm working with. So now how do I help bring that out? How do I align with their values in particular? Because if I can align with a family's values or individual's values, I can help, really kind of guide them along the change process. And so right now I consult to help companies to build in the space, to grow in the space, to optimize, to deliver better outcomes. I am invested in several businesses in the space. In particular, a very heart-driven project is a Medicaid-based program for indigent or homeless women in the state of Virginia, the Aligned Living Collective, and then continuing to explore the next venture, which absolutely will be some way to create a private pay type of experience, which would be normally seen at $20,000 or $30,000 a month, but really for very affordable care, whether it's on Medicaid, state-funded insurance, things like that. So really just continuing to explore opportunities of how can we use the knowledge that we've gained over all of these years working in this space to help more and more people.
I'm going to refrain from my reaction to hearing about all the things that you're doing. Obviously, you can see my face. Like I'm like, at the edge of my seat wanting to share kind of my thoughts, but I want to ask a question before I dive into it.
Sure.
If 13 or even 23-year-old Christopher was seeing you now at 39, obviously those are two very different people, right, at different times. So I'll just let you answer it however you want or from whichever perspective. But just curious what you think that young person would see if they saw you now.
I don't think at that time there was an ability to actually even consider that I could have the life that I have today. I think that things were so dark, and the ability to look and to look at the future is so limited when we're that age as well, whether it's 13 or 23. Time is for example, 30 days is like unimaginable to a 13-year-old kid or even a 19-year-old kid. And yet 30 days today goes, overnight. 30 days happens. For some reason, what's coming to me is when I went to Wilderness, I went to what I would consider like the greatest wilderness program ever. It no longer exists. And all the treatment experiences I had and all the schools I went to, I don't remember anybody. And yet I remember and still have relationships with almost everybody that ran the wilderness program I went to. These people are still like part of my life. I have relationships with them. Some of them I've hired for businesses I'm involved with. There was such an impact of love that I had experienced. And so, again, that it's not addressing your question directly, but something just came up in the sense that the thing that has stuck with me after all of these years, no matter what and when, is the experience I had when somebody showed me unconditional love and told me that I was enough. And that I didn't need to perform. I didn't need to be anything. I didn't need to go to a specific school. I didn't need to play a specific sport, like none of that was relevant. It was that like I was enough as a human being, like just the way that I was. And so looking back, I think maybe from like an egotistical perspective, I could have been like, oh, of course, like, you know, you'll rule the world and you'll be doing all this great stuff. But did I really believe it? No. I mean, I'm not sure at that age that I actually thought that I'd see 25. Like I was pretty clear that between the things I was doing kind of from a lifestyle perspective, as well as the things I was putting into my body and the life I was living, I really don't even think that I was able to see. I thought, you know, if I make it to 25, that will probably be, you know, a real milestone journey.
Okay. Well, last question, because I'm, especially for folks that I don't know, who I'm interviewing for the podcast, I usually ask the question, you know, do you see yourself as successful? And I do want to hear you answer that as a like follow up to that initial question, right? For somebody who didn't think that they were going to make it past 25. But my closing question really is just from a place of curiosity. You know, when I reached out to you and we had kind of connected on LinkedIn, what intrigued you or interested you in actually being a guest on the podcast? So 2 final questions, obviously asking you like as a guest, like I ask all of my guests, do you see yourself as successful? And then let's close out with what interested you in being a guest.
Sure. So I love, right? Success is subjective because it's so true. I mean, I was telling my partner the other night at dinner, I said, you know, one of the things I think that has made me successful, and I don't think it's good, but has been this like underlying belief that I've continued to have to really work through in a variety of ways with, you know, therapy and all these different things around not being good enough. Right. So like underneath, there's been this like motivation, which I don't think is like a healthy motivation, but is like, yeah, you're not good enough. So you continue to try and do things and to be better. And then on the flip side of that, right, is this like almost sense of superiority, right? Which again, both of those are not healthy in any way, but it reflects upon how I was raised, right? And so these are things that like I'm unwinding that I don't want to pass on to, you know, I'm about to have a baby, my first baby. I don't want to pass that on to her in any way, but there's this sense of when I can step out of both of those, right, which is kind of this better than or less than mentality, I think that absolutely my life's been a success. And again, this is tonight, I literally will celebrate 16 years, even though I celebrated 16 years sober on Monday. The fact that I have been sober is just one in itself is absolute success from where I came from and the depths and the darkness that I experienced. And so I think my family, like even if I, you know, lived with my mom and didn't have a good job or any of that, I still think my mom would be like, you're an absolute success just because of the fact that you've been able to transform your life in this way. And so when I can step out of kind of the ego or again, that better than, less than mentality, I can absolutely say that it's been success in so many different ways, in relationships and family and business and my life and my health and my well-being and the way that I try to show up in the world the best that I can. So that I think is kind of a unique perspective on success. What drew me to the podcast is, of course, your work and your work with families. Like we have this beautiful opportunity today through the ability to leverage digital content, podcasting, audio, video, all of these things to reach so many people that when I was growing up, like my family didn't have this opportunity. They didn't have the opportunity to jump on and to hear stories like this. And there's such power in storytelling. And it's something we've been missing in our society and our culture today, is the passing on of wisdom from one generation to the next. And it's just like not a part of who we are culturally anymore. And so what draws me to an opportunity like this is the opportunity to potentially touch, right, or connect with or have a family hear something and say, wow, that sounds exactly like my kid. That sounds exactly like my story. Because I remember how often when I was working directly with families, they would say, so you're telling me there's a chance, there's hope. And I would say, well, absolutely, right? Like I am the example of getting to a place of it being so bad and having a family doing everything they can to help so much. And yet here's my life today, right? And so absolutely that any opportunity I have to provide a little bit of inspiration, hope to a family to say like, you know, in many ways, like what's happening right now will not be what's happening tomorrow or next week, next month, next year, and to just keep continuing to push forward. And so again, any opportunity I have to connect directly with families, especially in a medium like this, where we can touch so many people through, a half-hour interview is just a beautiful opportunity.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much for carving out the time to share your story and to truly impact all of the listeners that are hearing this. I mean, I hear from parents all the time. What I love about this podcast is they don't hire me, but they listen to the stories, and it does instill hope. It instills hope when we are in the thick of it in the moment, knowing that things can get better, that my child they can make it past 25 if right now it's really hard for me to understand how we're going to get past next week. So again, thank you for being a guest, and we'll make sure we have your contact information in the show notes for anybody that wants to reach out to you, parents, just to connect, but then also I think for programs that are looking for a little bit more heart-centered approach in their vision in the programming, to also connect with you from an entrepreneurial perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to be here.
That's it for this week's Success is Subjective episode. We want to thank our guest for joining Joanna on the show this week and for being willing to share your journey. This podcast would not exist if it weren't for people such as yourself. Stay tuned for our next episode, where you can bet it'll be another amazing human sharing their personal story with the world. Make sure you check out the show notes, where you will find contact information, website details, and all social media for our guest. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, you can email Joanna at lilyconsulting.com. Be sure to check out the lilyconsulting.com website for additional resources outside of podcasting. Now, if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review. You can also download to listen to the Success is Subjective podcast on other popular podcast apps, such as Audible, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. Thanks again for listening in, and remember, there is no single path through life. Success is what you make it.
Do you have a teenager or young adult who seems to have lost their way? Maybe they need help navigating adolescence, adulthood, and decisions surrounding higher education. Or maybe they have become withdrawn, their grades are slipping, or they are flat out living a reckless lifestyle, and you're concerned about their health and well-being. If this describes what your teen or young adult is facing, a therapeutic consultant may be able to help. Mental health, addiction recovery, and higher education can all be equally expensive. While information is everywhere, how do you know what option is the best one for your family? Some parents have the time to research and navigate this on their own. Some don't. If the latter applies to you, enter therapeutic consultants. Therapeutic consultants, like Joanna, listen to your family's specific needs and advocate on behalf of your loved one. TCs will research therapeutic resources, recommend treatment programs, and assist during adulthood transitions. Not being affiliated with any program, their support is completely objective and catered toward the best interest of each unique family. To find a qualified therapeutic consultant to work with, check out TCA, also known as the Therapeutic Consulting Association. Their website is therapeuticconsulting.org, all one word. Again, that's therapeuticconsulting.org. Then click the Find a Pro tab up at the top.